All right, you guys, here it is, the at-home lecture for SAT, and today we're going to be talking about World War II. As always, we like to start here on our context slide. We like to build up a little bit of context. Hopefully you guys had a good review of the between the wars or interwar period, and have completed the timeline that we were working on in class on Tuesday. In looking at the essential question here, how and why did U.S. participation in World War II transform American society? We have to look at mobilization. We have to look at how we got prepared for the war effort. And, we have to think about the fact that we had been operating under the guise of isolation, right? That we were isolated from other world issues. And wanted to stay out of the conflict that had started back in 1939. But as we look at this, the success of the Allied forces heavily depended on how quickly the U.S. could mobilize people, industry, creative and scientific communities, etc. And we're going to see the role of the federal government maximized in order to mobilize for the war. And that's kind of a continuation from the New Deal. So if we look at some of the government programs that were created in a response to the war, these are very similar to World War I. This is government created and operated agencies. So for the first one is the War Production Board. This is basically going to manage all of the war industries, telling different businesses and companies what they had to produce for the war effort. We also had the Office of War Mobilization, which controlled raw materials and kind of quotas for what needed to be produced and when. And then a new one for World War II is the Office of Price Administration. The goal here was to avoid big inflation rates after the war, so it regulated different aspects of civilian life. It set prices, wages, rents, rationing on things like meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, sugar, gas, tires, that's a typo, for Anthony and Alan, who will be thinking about the typo in my class. The war, it proved that the New Deal did not, in fact, fix the Depression. It was mobilization that got us officially out of the Depression. Obviously, business and industry are going to be heavily stimulated by the demands that came during wartime. It's going to increase government spending. We're going to see businesses having huge demands. The Depression is going to end, and we had an unemployment rate of almost 0 by 1944. We mass-produced planes and tanks and ships, and a plane or ship could be made in under 15 days in order to combat the Nazis and the Japanese in what became a war of attrition. Now, a continuity here, there were just a few number of companies that controlled 70% of the American manufacturing, so we still had this unequal distribution of wealth. We will see a huge emphasis on research and development, specifically math and science. We'll start to see different colleges and universities creating labs to have specific studies for different technologies that will help to win the war. So things like radar and sonar, which were used in airplanes and in ships, in submarines. Of course, penicillin is going to help in saving people's lives, soldiers that had been injured. We're going to have the fastest and best jet engines and rockets that are shot from planes, and then, of course, the Manhattan Project. So we're going to see a huge increase in the emphasis on math and science to get ahead in these areas from Germany. We're also going to see a lot of really famous European scientists and intellectuals come to the United States to avoid fascism and things like the Holocaust. As far as worker unions go, we obviously do not want people striking during wartime. So ironically enough, these businesses are going to find a way to meet the workers' demands. Of course, there were still unhappy workers, but for the most part, we're going to see a decrease in striking during the war. And In the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act of 1943, the government did decide, though, that they can take over any war industry threatened by a strike, basically just ensuring that the work production is continuing. As far as financing the war goes, we are going to use a lot of civilian involvement. We, of course, had to pay for huge increases in spending. So one of the things we did is we increased the income tax. So people who, their incomes were taxed by the federal government. And war bonds. Of course, Americans wanted to help. Times were very patriotic. So people bought war bonds, $135 billion from war bonds. Propaganda was a humongous piece of World War II to kind of convince and motivate Americans to get involved in the production efforts. And so you can see different, famous ones like We Can Do It with Rosie the Riveter. I always like this one, When You Ride Alone, You Ride with Hitler. And this is talking about rationing of gas. So, we've got Stamp Out the Axis Powers, encouraging workers, the Uncle Sam hat, etc. And then, of course, we have the Four Freedoms in the Office of War Information. The government is putting out so much more information. The American people knew more about what was going on. And, of course, FDR is still doing his fireside chats. The war had outreaching impacts on many, many different groups within society. It's going to create tons of different migrations. So we're going to see a mass migration for different industrial jobs to the Midwest. And then, of course, the Pacific Coast is going to draw shipbuilders. That's where most of our shipbuilding is going to take place in cities like San Diego. We have new communities that are going to spring up around different military bases and factories. We are going to see a growth of some defense installations in the South, and eventually we're going to see a huge migration to the Sun Belt, so where it's warmer after the war. African Americans played a major, major role in the war effort. We're going to see it, 1.5 million people leave the South for jobs in the North, and over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces. The first time that they could be pilots. We'll see that with the Tuskegee Airmen up here. Now, that did not mean that all discrimination was just left behind because African Americans were serving in the war. There was still a lot of racial violence. Even within different infantries, there's going to be racism. There were some riots in New York that were very damaging to the morale and resentment towards Black people who were moving into northern cities. And that's going to just kind of cause this negative tension and energy. Now, a huge concept here is the double V. The double V campaign was something that African Americans had hoped for, that if we can create a victory against fascism, then we should also have a victory against racism at home. So the double V campaign became huge in encouraging African Americans to get involved in the war effort in the kind of hope or promise that when they got back from the war, when the war ended, we would also see a rise or an end in racism. Because, the argument is that it's hypocritical, that we're fighting for democracy, but we also live in a democracy where there's extreme racism and discrimination. Throughout the war, there was Executive Order 8802, which prohibited discrimination in the government, allowing Black leaders to become part of different government jobs. In Smith versus Allwright, it was found unconstitutional to deny membership in any political party or voting in primaries to African Americans. We're also going to see an unusual shift to the United States by Mexican Americans throughout the war. They called this bracero programs, which basically encouraged Mexicans to move to the United States in temporary work programs. And we will see some really big discrimination, especially in San Diego and LA, in what are called the Zoot Suit riots. Zoot suits were different suits that Mexican Americans typically wore They had very wide legs, in the padded shoulders, and there were the outbreak of violence between the Zoot Suiters and the Mexican Americans and sailors, as part of the U.S. Navy in L.A. in Southern California. Super, super important to the war effort were the Native Americans that served in the military. 25,000 Native Americans worked in the military, and they worked as what are called the Navajo, Navajo code talkers. So our code that could not be broken by the Axis powers was all done in like a Native American language of the Navajo. So it was impossible for them to break or learn. Now, of course, as Japan was the enemy, the Japanese Americans are going to experience extreme discrimination during the war. And after Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor, the government created a very clear message that no Japanese can be trusted. So, under Executive Order 9066, FDR is going to require 100,000 Japanese living on the West Coast into internment camps throughout New Mexico. And you can see some of the camps, the pictures from the camps over here. It was not until 1988 that the federal government finally paid reparations to those still alive who had been put into internment camps. And reparations in the sense of they were taken from their homes. They were allowed to bring with them like maybe one or two personal items, and otherwise they just lost their jobs, their homes, everything that they had was taken from them. And a lot of like squatters and stuff in those areas took over their homes. Women, of course, are going to play a huge role. 200,000 served in military non-combat jobs. 5 million women entered the workforce at home. You know, we famously talk about Rosie the Riveter and We Can Do It. Because women had to take on the role of men as the men were off fighting in the Pacific or in Europe. 24% of married women entered the workforce, which is an astronomical number for the time. Of course, women were always paid less than men in these jobs for the most part. But we do see kind of this liberation for women, and that women do become more of independent and self-sufficient while men are away. And then we have wartime solidarity. Of course, racism was still terrible, but the war did help ease a little bit of those tensions. And, the United States had come together on this nationalistic approach to becoming ready for the war. So this was really, really big. And we're going to see some shifts in the right direction. All right, we're going to take a quick brain break. You can see here, this is causes and effects. Our first brain break quiz question here. Let's see here. Which APUSH teacher graduated from the Ohio State University? Your answer is Mr. Play. Okay, so context here for military, World War II military. When we're looking at the military, we obviously were trying very hard to stay out of the war and remain isolated, or the myth of isolation. But once Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, there was a declaration of war against the Axis powers, and the United States begins to fight on two fronts. We have the European theater, the Western theater, and the Pacific theater. So we're going to be fighting on two different fronts. The fighting in Europe started in 1939. Hitler had been using his blitzkrieg throughout, Poland, and then through Denmark and Norway and Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and France, and the French had already surrendered and the Battle of Britain had already taken place, right? Hitler was wreaking havoc throughout Europe. So, there were kind of two options here. The Allies had two plans. And the Soviet victory. There was a major Soviet victory at Stalingrad when the Germans were trapped inside the city and Hitler refuses to surrender, and hundreds of thousands of his troops are going to perish during this battle. So, we have, for at least U.S. involvement, the first kind of idea here is that we have to overcome German subs in the Atlantic. So the Battle of the Atlantic was a naval battle, and the U.S. had to create anti-submarine warfare. So we start to begin to use radar and sonar and anti-submarine mines, and this is going to help to neutralize the Germans. Then, of course, we start bombing raids, or what we call strategic bombing, on German cities. So we are going to hit as many, railroad lines, and factories, and anything that we can hit to stall production for the Germans. There were a lot of civilians killed through this strategic bombing, but strategic bombing was a huge part of World War II, and added to the civilian casualty and the outreach of death via the civilians. Now, we also had Operation Torch, which was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower in Montgomery of Britain. And this is the invasion of North Africa, or what we call the North Africa Campaign, which then led to the invasion of Sicily. So once the Allied powers are able to push the Germans out of North Africa, they have direct access to the southern or soft underbelly of Europe, Italy. So we're going to occupy Sicily by 1943. We're going to invade Italy, and then Hitler is forced to send troops down into a new southern front so that the Italians do not surrender that early in the war. So this is going to break up Hitler's army after they've already suffered this great defeat at Stalingrad. The U.S. does eventually crush the Italian forces and control in Italy. And then, of course, on June 6, 1944, one of the most historic battles in the modern history is the D-Day invasion, or Operation Overlord, led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. The Allied forces, including the United States, Great Britain, France, Canada, and Australia, are going to storm the beaches of Normandy, France. The goal is to then liberate as many small cities as they can on their way to Paris, to take France back from the Germans. There was one last German counterattack, one more German offensive to try to push back into Paris. That's called the Battle of the Bulge. So they pushed one last major time, but the Allied powers had too much manpower and pushed the Germans back in towards Berlin. So finally, Germany is going to surrender. Basically, cities like Berlin were completely obliterated by the strategic bombing. In April of 1945, Hitler does complete killing himself or suicide, and Stalin is advancing from the east. Nazis do surrender 1 week later on May 7th, or what we call VE Day, 1945. As Allied forces liberate Germany, they also are going to discover the Holocaust, the concentration camps that existed throughout Eastern Europe. And 6 million Jews and up to 11 million people were killed during this process. Okay, so we also are going to have to talk about the Pacific. So the U.S. was responsible for defeating Japan in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan controlled Korea, Eastern China, the Philippines, and different territories throughout the East Indies and the Dutch East Indies. That's supposed to say Dutch. British, Burma, and French Indochina. So countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Whew, a lot of typos here. In this, the U.S. is going to have to use island hopping to start taking back these islands. But the turning point was in 1942 when the U.S. destroys 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in the Battle of Midway. This is considered the turning point of the war because after this we can really get into our island hopping campaign. The goal is to hop onto different Japanese-controlled islands, take them so that the U.S. is as close to the mainland of Japan as possible. Some of the major battles in the Pacific, of course, the Philippines. The Japanese are able to defeat Douglas MacArthur at the Philippines on the first go-around, but the U.S. comes back and fights in the Philippines a second time because, MacArthur says, "I shall return," and he's successful. We have the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the U.S. destroys a couple of different Japanese naval ships. But this is where Japan begins to use kamikaze suicide attacks on U.S. ships. So basically they would fly their ships or their planes into ships and sacrifice their lives in order for victory. And then, of course, too, we have the Battle of Okinawa, which is about 500 miles off the coast of the mainland of Japan. This was a huge kamikaze attack. It was a extremely bloody battle. If you're ever looking for war movies to watch, Hacksaw Ridge is based on the Battle of Okinawa. This is also where Mrs. Wong's family is from. So interesting fact, my husband would not be here in this world if it weren't for Okinawa, and his grandma survived the Battle of Okinawa, where all of her siblings did not. Okay, after Okinawa, the U.S. was kind of gearing up for, what are we going to do? What's this last step to get an unconditional surrender? And, we're getting close enough to launch an invasion of the Japanese island. So FDR has since passed, and the new president, Harry Truman, says that Japan must unconditionally surrender or face utter destruction. Under Robert Oppenheimer at Los Alamos, we're going to test the Trinity bomb in New Mexico, and we are going to drop those bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, killing 250,000 civilians immediately, and that doesn't even count those who died after the radiation exposure. I do think at war in mortality from World War I to World War II, the U.S. shifted from a policy of not killing civilians when possible to absolutely firebombing Japanese cities, to dropping atomic bombs to prevent further casualties. We saw this as kind of a necessary evil. The Germans and the British both bombed civilian centers throughout World War II to reduce industrial output, although that didn't always happen. When the U.S. entered World War I because they were upset over the German subs killing civilians, then how can we do the same thing? The world does now agree that nuclear weapons could end most human life. But finally, after the dropping of the atomic bombs, 2 weeks after the second bomb, Japan does agree to unconditionally surrender if the emperor could stay on as a powerless kind of figurehead. MacArthur receives the official surrender on board the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, and the U.S. will remain in occupied Japan for years to come to help Japan rebuild so that they don't fall to communism. All right, another brain break. We're doing pretty good here. I know a lot of you are looking to get into some Fortnite today. So if you could let Miss Wong know about your Fortnite successes on Thursday, that'd be great. But our last section here, we're going to talk about World War II and post-war diplomacy. So the U.S., Great Britain, and the Soviet Union was at times an unlikely partnership, but this is who is going to become, this new world order, if you will. For starters, FDR did win a fourth presidential nomination in 1944. But he did not have the same vice president. He replaced Henry Wallace with Harry S. Truman, who is going to ultimately take over when FDR passes. There are a couple important, very important wartime conferences. The big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, did agree to secretly meet and plan different strategies for the ending of and the setting up after the war. So Casablanca, that's basically when they decide of the North Africa campaign and invading Italy or the soft underbelly of Europe. Tehran was the first Big Three meeting in November of 1943, basically fighting on the eastern and western fronts for Germany. Now, one of the most important meetings of modern history is the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. All three were present, and they agreed that Germany would lose 1/4 of territory to Poland and the Soviet Union, of their territory. Free elections after the war. The Soviets would enter the war against Japan in 1945. The Soviets would control 2 islands in the Pacific and have special concessions in Manchuria, which they had taken over. And then the conference would be held in San Francisco for New World Peace Organization, the United Nations. So they're also going to divide up Germany into 4 zones to try to avoid the issues that stemmed from World War I. Each of the zones was occupied by an allied country. Okay, rest in peace, FDR. And then comes in Truman, who will meet with Attlee and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference. And at this conference, this was basically when they officially made the 4 zones and deemed the Japanese needing to unconditionally surrender. Truman also tells Stalin at this meeting that they have an atomic weapon and it works and he should be worried. So, the cost of the war, the legacy of the war, you can see the pictures on the right. Cities were completely leveled. 70 to 80 million died worldwide. 1/3 of those were Soviets. 400,000 Americans were killed and 800,000 were wounded, although the U.S. lost very few civilians. The economic cost was exponential. The U.S. does emerge as the wealthiest nation in the world, despite having huge debts because of some of those things we put into place throughout the war. We also didn't lend as much before the war. The war also wasn't fought in the United States, so we didn't have damage to our infrastructure, where a lot of places were just completely devastated. And the U.S. was the most powerful country in the world. And so we played a huge role learning from our mistakes of not joining the League of Nations in the post-war deliberations. We created what is called the United Nations, which is obviously still around today, the International Peacekeeping Organization in 1945. They wrote the charter, and we actually accept being a member nation. So some of these expectations leaving the war, Americans were very nervous about the post-war world. They were nervous about inflation, how do we bring these boys back home, etc. But the Soviet Union had, started to create what we kind of call the Eastern Bloc. So the U.S. proposes nuclear disarmament to the United Nations, but the Soviet Union says no. So we usher in a new era of communism and democracy, or East versus West, known as the Cold War. Whew, we did it.